So Bell Hooks states that canons secure institutions and institutions secure canons. When we only allow mainstream repertoire lists to dictate what we teach in piano lessons, we ensure a gender and racially biased narrative where the voices of women are not present. Sorry, the voices of women of color are not present. So for the next few minutes, we're going to dive into the history of gender and racial inequity in mainstream piano curriculum in Canada specifically, through the lens of music conservatory syllabi. I'm going to present over 50 years of data points from multiple Canadian conservatories, looking at why the piano canon has an intersectionality problem and what we can do about it. Next, I'm going to point you to resources that can help us to address the gaping hole in piano repertoire resources. And we're going to look at some newly graded piano resources by BIPOC women from preparatory to diploma levels. So in a study done in 2020 at the University of Ottawa, private music teachers in Canada were surveyed on the content of their music lessons. When asked whether they agreed that racism in music education was a problem, 57.3% said they agreed, 19.5% did not believe that it's a problem, and 23.2% appeared neutral. Only 16% of teachers, though, on this next slide, only 16% of teachers were actively prioritizing teaching music by BIPOC composers. So this means that 57% of teachers believed that racism was in classical music was a problem, but only a very small portion of them were teaching the music of BIPOC composers. And when we pushed harder on this and in more of our research and in the commentary after at the end of the survey, we found that most people felt that they didn't have access to the resources in order to teach more music by BIPOC composers. So there are two main tenets of this research. I first addressed the gap in the conservatory piano curricula in Canada, and I examined the disparity of representation of women, specifically Black, Indigenous, and women of color in piano curriculum using a SongData methodology, which was honed by Dr. Jada Watson. And this takes into account both the biographic and the bibliographic data of songwriters, or in my case, piano composers. The second portion of this project is the development of piano curricular resources that elevate the voices of Black, Indigenous, and women of color. So in my research work, I then curated a piano syllabus of nearly 4,000 compositions by women that center the voices of women of color, and I graded hundreds of compositions according to the conservatory methods. And then I created a piano syllabus as an accessible resource for teachers to teach graded music by women. In doing this, I hope that the pieces become part of the mainstream piano repertoire. In Canada, for better or for worse, we tend to have a lot of allegiance to the conservatory system. Our two main conservatories are Conservatory Canada and the Royal Conservatory of Music, which I know also has some centers in the US. So if students want to participate in festivals or in competitions, they often have to choose music out of conservatory syllabi. So in a sense, the syllabi then become the piano curriculum or the guidebooks for piano music in Canada. Classical music culture conditions musicians to know which composers to like or dislike through inclusion or exclusion practices. Dr. Samantha Ajay says that she was, quote, inoculated to see classical music as the exclusive domain of white men, end quote. The music and names that we hear from early on in our music training define what we want to play. Music resources shape what musicians teach, what students learn, perform, and listen to. In my research, I explore the unconscious racial and gender bias in conservatory piano syllabi and advocate for the inclusion and representation of BIPOC women. I also want to preface the data by saying that this study was done before the release of the new syllabi for both conservatories. So Conservatory Canada and the Royal Conservatory of Music both re-released their music syllabi, and I have to say they have done a really nice job of improving their inclusion. And so, but I've yet to do a follow-up study as my PhD research has taken up the majority of my time right now. And I also want to mention that I don't do this to criticize any conservatory, but rather as an assessment of where we are so we can see where we need to go.